Chapter 17. A Royal Banquet. Madame, seeing me pacific and unresentful, no doubt judged that I was deceived by her excuse, for her fright dissolved away, and she was soon so importunate as to have me give an exhibition and kill somebody, that the thing grew to be embarrassing. However, to my relief, she was presently interrupted by the call to prayers. I will say this much for the nobility, that tyrannical, murderous, rapacious, and morally rotten as they were deeply and enthusiastically religious. Nothing could divert them from the regular and faithful performance of the pieties enjoined by the Church. More than once I had seen a noble who had gotten his enemy at a disadvantage stop to pray before cutting his throat. More than once I had seen a noble, after ambushing and dispatching his enemy, retire to the nearest wayside shrine and humbly give thanks, without even waiting to rob the body. There was to be nothing finer or sweeter in the life of even Benvenuto Cellini, that rough-hewn saint 10 centuries later. All the nobles of Britain with their families attended divine service morning and night daily in their private chapels, and even the worst of them had family worship 5 or 6 times a day besides. The credit of this belonged entirely to the Church. Although I was no friend to that Catholic Church, I was obliged to admit this. And often, in spite of me, I found myself saying, what would this country be without the Church? After prayers, we had dinner in a great banquet hall, which was lighted by hundreds of grease jets, and everything was as fine and lavish and rudely splendid as might become the royal degree of the hosts. At the head of the hall, on a dais, was the table of the king, queen, and their son, Prince Owain. Stretching down the hall from this was the general table on the floor. At this, above the salt, sat the visiting nobles and the grown members of their families, of both sexes. The resident court, in effect, 61 persons. Below the salt sat minor officers of the household with their principal subordinates, altogether 118 persons, sitting, and about as many liveried servants standing behind their chairs, or serving in one capacity or another. It was a very fine show. In a gallery, a band with cymbals, horns, harps, and other horrors opened the proceedings with what seemed to be the crude first draft or original agony of the wail known centuries later as "In the Sweet By and By." It was new and ought to have been rehearsed a little more. For some reason or other, the Queen had the composer hanged after dinner. After this music, the priest, who stood behind the royal table, said a long, noble grace in ostensible Latin. Then the battalion of waiters broke away from their posts, and darted, rushed, flew, fetched, and carried, and the mighty feeding began. No words anywhere, but absorbing attention to business. The rows of chops opened and shut in vast unison, and the sound of it was like to the muffled burr of subterranean machinery. The havoc continued an hour and a half, and unimaginable was the destruction of substantials. Of the chief feature of the feast, the huge wild boar that lay stretched out so portly and imposing at the start, nothing was left but the semblance of a hoop-skirt, and he was but the type and symbol of what had happened to all the other dishes. With the pastries and so on, the heavy drinking began, and the talk. Gallon after gallon of wine and mead disappeared, and everybody got comfortable, then happy, then sparklingly joyous, both sexes, and by pretty noisy. Men told anecdotes that were terrific to hear, but nobody blushed, and when the nub was sprung, the assemblage let go with a horse laugh that shook the fortress. Ladies answered back with historiettes that would almost have made Queen Margaret of Navarre or even the great Elizabeth of England hide behind a handkerchief. But nobody hid here, but only laughed, howled, you may say. In pretty much all of these dreadful stories, ecclesiastics were the hardy heroes, but that didn't worry the chaplain any. He had his laugh with the rest. More than that, upon invitation, he roared out a song which was of as daring a sort as any that was sung that night. By midnight everybody was fagged out, and and sore with laughing, and, as a rule, drunk. Some weepingly, some affectionately, some hilariously, some quarrelsomely, some dead and under the table. Of the ladies, the worst spectacle was a lovely young duchess, whose wedding eve this was, and indeed she was a spectacle, sure enough. Just as she was, she could have sat in advance for the portrait of the young daughter of the Regent Orleans, and the family dinner whence she was carried, foul-mouthed, intoxicated, and helpless, to her bed, in the lost and lamented days of ancient Rome. Suddenly, even while the priest was lifting his hands, and all conscious heads were bowed in reverent expectation of the coming blessing, there appeared under the arch of the far-off door, at the bottom of the hall, an old and bent and white-haired lady, leaning upon a crutch-stick, and she lifted the stick and pointed it toward the queen, and cried out, "The wrath and curse of God fall upon you, woman without pity, who have slain mine innocent grandchild, and made desolate this old heart that had nor chick, nor friend, nor stay, nor comfort in all this world but him." Everybody crossed himself in a grisly fright, for a curse was an awful thing to those people. But the queen rose up majestic, with the deathlight in her eye, and flung back this ruthless command: "Lay hands on her! To the stake with her!" The guards left their posts to obey. It was a shame. It was a cruel thing to see, but what could be done? Sandy gave me a look. I knew she had another inspiration. I said, "Do what you choose." She was up and facing toward the queen in a moment. She indicated me and said, "Madame, he saith this may not be. Recall the commandment, or he will dissolve the castle, and it shall vanish away like the unstable fabric of a dream." Confound it, what a crazy contract to pledge a person to. What if the queen... But my consternation subsided there, and my panic passed off, for the queen, all in a collapse, made no show of resistance, but gave a countermanding sign, and sunk to her seat. When she reached it, she was sober. So were many of the others. The assemblage rose, whiffed ceremony to the winds, and rushed for the door like a mob. Overturning chairs, smashing crockery, tugging, struggling, shouldering, crowding, anything to get out before I should change my mind and puff the castle into the measureless dim vacancies of space. Well, 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 they were a superstitious lot. It is all a body can do to conceive of it. The poor queen was so scared and humbled that she was even afraid to hang the composer without first consulting me. I was very sorry for her, indeed, as anyone would have been, for she was really suffering, so I was willing to do anything that was reasonable, and had no desire to carry things to wanton extremities. I therefore considered the matter thoughtfully, and ended by having the musicians ordered into our presence to play that sweet By and By again, which they did. Then I saw that she was right, and gave her permission to hang the whole band. This little relaxation of sternness had a good effect upon the queen. A statesman gains little by the arbitrary exercise of ironclad authority upon all occasions that offer, for this wounds the just pride of his subordinates, and thus tends to undermine his strength. A little concession, now and then, where it can do no harm, is the wiser policy. Now that the queen was at ease in her mind once more, and measurably happy, her wine naturally began to assert itself again, and it got a little the start of her. I mean, it set her music going, her silver bell of a tongue. Dear me, she was a master talker. It would not become me to suggest that it was pretty late and that I was a tired man and very sleepy. I wished I had gone off to bed when I had the chance. Now I must stick it out. There was no other way. So she tinkled along and along in the otherwise profound and ghostly hush of the sleeping castle, until by and by there came, as if from deep down under us, a far-away sound, as of a muffled shriek, with an expression of agony about it that made my flesh crawl. The queen stopped, and her eyes lighted with pleasure. She tilted her graceful head as a bird does when it listens. The sound bored its way up through the stillness again. "What is it?" I said. It is truly a stubborn soul, and endureth long. It is many hours now. Endureth what? The rack. Come, ye shall see a blithe sight. And he yield not his secret now, ye shall see him torn asunder. What a silky smooth hellion she was, and so composed and serene, when the cords all down my legs were hurting in sympathy with that man's pain. Conducted by mailed guards bearing flaring torches, we tramped along echoing corridors, and down stone stairways, dank and dripping, and smelling of mold and ages of imprisoned night. A chill, uncanny journey, and a long one, and not made the shorter or the cheerier by the sorceress's talk, which was about this sufferer and his crime. He had been accused by an anonymous informer of having killed a stag in the royal preserves. I said, "Anonymous testimony isn't just the right thing, your highness. It were fairer to confront the accused with the accuser." I had not thought of that, it being but of small consequence. But an I would, I could not, for that the accuser came, masked by night, and told the forester, and straightway got him hence again, and so the forester knoweth him not. Then is this unknown the only person who saw the stag killed? Marry, no man saw the stag killed, but this unknown saw this hardy wretch near the spot where the stag lay, and came with right loyal zeal, and betrayed him to the forester. So the unknown was near the dead stag, too? Isn't it just possible that he did the killing himself? His loyal zeal in a mask looks just a shade suspicious. But what is your highness's idea for racking the prisoner? Where is the profit? He will not confess, else, and then were his soul lost. For his crime his life is forfeited by the law, and of a surety will I see that he payeth it. But it were peril to mine own soul to let him die unconfessed and unabsolved. Nay, I were a fool to fling me into hell for his accommodation. But, your highness, suppose he has had nothing to confess. As to that, we shall see anon. An I rack him to death, and he confess not, it will peradventure show that he had indeed naught to confess, yet will grant that that is sooth. Then shall I not be damned for an unconfessed man that had naught to confess, wherefore I shall be safe. It was the stubborn unreasoning of the time. It was useless to argue with her. Arguments have no chance against petrified training. They wear it as little as the waves wear a cliff. And her training was everybody's. The brightest intellect in the land would not have been able to see that her position was defective. As we entered the rack cell, I caught a picture that will not go from me. I wish it would. A native young giant of 30 or thereabouts lay stretched upon the frame of it on his back, with his wrists and ankles tied to ropes which led over windlasses at either end. There was no color in him. His features were contorted and set, and sweat drops stood upon his forehead. A priest bent over him on each side. The executioner stood by. Guards were on duty. Smoking torches stood in sockets along the walls. In a corner crouched a poor young creature, her face drawn with anguish, a half-wild and hunted look in her eyes, and in her lap lay a little child asleep. Just as we stepped across the threshold, the executioner gave his machine a slight turn, which wrung a cry from both the prisoner and the woman. But I shouted, and the executioner released the strain, without waiting to see who spoke. I could not let this horror go on. It would have killed me to see it. I asked the queen to let me clear the place and speak to the prisoner privately, and when she was going to object, I spoke in a low voice and said that I did not want to make a scene before her servants, but I must have my way, for I was King Arthur's representative and was speaking in his name. She saw she had to yield. I asked her to endorse me to these people and then leave. It was not pleasant for her, but she took the pill and even went further than I was meaning to require. I only wanted the backing of her own authority, but she said, "Ye will do in all things as this lord shall command. It is the boss." It was certainly a good word to conjure with. You could see it by the squirming of these rats. The Queen's guards fell into line, and she and they marched away with their torch-bearers and woke the echoes of the cavernous tunnels with the measured beat of their retreating footfalls. I had the prisoner taken from the rack and placed upon his bed, and medications applied to his hurts, and wine given him to drink. The woman crept near and looked on, eagerly, lovingly, but timorously, like one who fears a repulse. Indeed, she tried furtively to touch the man's forehead, and jumped back, the picture of fright, when I turned unconsciously towards her. It was pitiful to see. "Lord," I said, "stroke him, lass, if you want to. Do anything you're a mind to. Don't mind me." Why, her eyes were as grateful as an animal's when you do it a kindness that it understands. The baby was out of her way, and she had her cheek against the man's in a minute, and her hands fondling his hair, and her happy tears running down. The man revived and caressed his wife with his eyes, which was all he could do. I judged I might clear the den now, and I did. Cleared it of all but the family and myself. Then I said, "Now, my friend, tell me your side of this matter. I know the other side." The man moved his head in sign of refusal, but the woman looked pleased, as it seemed to me, pleased with my suggestion. I went on. "You know of me?" "Yes, all do in Arthur's realms." "If my reputation has come to you right and straight, you should not be afraid to speak." The woman broke in eagerly. "Ah, my fair lord, do thou persuade him. Thou canst and thou wilt. Ah, he suffereth so, and it is for me, and how can I bear it? I would I might see him die a sweet, swift death. Oh, my Hugo, I cannot bear this one." And she fell to sobbing and groveling about my feet, and still imploring. Imploring what? The man's death? I could not quite get the bearings of the thing. But Hugo interrupted her and said, "Peace. Ye wit not what ye ask. Shall I starve whom I love to win a gentle death? I wend thou knowest me better." "Well," I said, "I can't quite make this out. It is a puzzle. Now—" "Ah, my dear lord, and ye will but persuade him. Consider how these his tortures wound me. Oh, and he will not speak. Whereas the healing, the solace that lie in a blessed swift death—" "What are you maundering about? He's going out from here a free man and whole. He's not going to die." The man's white face lit up, and the woman flung herself at me in a most surprising explosion of joy, and cried out, "He is saved, for it is the king's word by the mouth of the king's servant, Arthur, the king whose word is gold." "Well, then, do you believe I can be trusted after all? Why didn't you before?" "Who doubted? Not I, indeed, and not she." "Well, why wouldn't you tell me your story, then?" "Ye had made no promise, else it had been otherwise." I see, and yet I believe I don't quite see, after all. You stood the torture and refused to confess, which shows plain enough to even the dullest understanding that you had nothing to confess. "Aye, my lord. How so? It was I that killed the deer." "You did? Oh dear, this is the most mixed-up business that ever—" "Dear lord, I begged him on my knees to confess, but—" "You did? It gets thicker and thicker. What did you want him to do that for?" "Sith it would bring him a quick death and save him all this cruel pain." "Well, yes, there is reason in that. But he didn't want the quick death." "He? Why, of a surety he did." "Well, then, why in the world didn't he confess?" "Ah, sweet sir, and leave my wife and chick without bread and shelter?" "Oh, heart of gold, now I see it. The bitter law takes the convicted man's estate and beggars his widows and his orphans. They could torture you to death, but without conviction or confession they could not rob you, your wife and baby. You stood by them like a man, and you, true wife and the woman that you are, you would have bought him with release from torture at cost to yourself of slow starvation and death. Well, it humbles a body to think what your sex can do when it comes to self-sacrifice. I'll book you both for my colony. You'll like it there. It's a factory where I'm going to turn groping and grubbing automata into men." Chapter 18. In the Queen's Dungeons. Well, I arranged all that, and I had the man sent to his home. I had a great desire to rack the executioner, not because he was a good, painstaking and pain-giving official, for surely it was not to his discredit that he performed his functions well, but to pay him back for wantonly cuffing and otherwise distressing that young woman. The priests told me about this, and were generously hot to have him punished. Something of this disagreeable sort was turning up every now and then. I mean, episodes that showed that not all priests were frauds and self-seekers, but that many, even the great majority of these that were down on the ground among the common people, were sincere and right-hearted, and devoted to the alleviation of human troubles and sufferings. Well, it was a thing which could not be helped, so I seldom fretted about it, and never many minutes at a time. It has never been my way to bother much about things which you can't cure. But I did not like it, for it was just the sort of thing to keep people reconciled to an established church. We must have a religion, it goes without saying, but my idea is to have it cut up into 40 free sects, so that they will police each other, as had been the case in the United States in my time. Concentration of power in a political machine is bad, and an established church is only a political machine. It was invented for that. It is nursed, cradled, preserved for that. It is an enemy to human liberty, and does no good which it could not better do in a split-up and scattered condition. That wasn't law, it wasn't gospel, it was only an opinion, my opinion, and I was only a man. One man, so it wasn't worth any more than the Pope's, or any less, for that matter. Well, I couldn't rack the executioner, neither would I overlook the just complaints of the priests. The man must be punished somehow or other, so I degraded him from his office and made him leader of the band, the new one that was to be started. He begged hard and said he couldn't play. A plausible excuse, but too thin. There wasn't a musician in the country that could. The Queen was a good deal outraged. Next morning, when she found she was going to have neither Hugo's life nor his property. But I told her she must bear this cross, that while by law and custom she certainly was entitled to both the man's life and his property, there were extenuating circumstances, and so in Arthur the King's name I had pardoned him. The deer was ravaging the man's fields, and he had killed it in sudden passion, and not for gain, and he had carried it into the royal forest in the hope that that might make the detection of the misdoer impossible. Confound her, I couldn't make her see that sudden passion is an extenuating circumstance in the killing of venison, or of a person. So I gave it up and let her sulk it out. I did think I was going to make her see it by remarking that her own sudden passion in the case of the page modified that crime. "Crime!" she exclaimed. "How thou talkest! Crime, forsooth! Man, I am going to pay for him." Oh, it was no use to waste sense on her. Training. Training is everything. Training is all there is to a person. We speak of nature. It is folly. There is no such thing as nature. What we call by that misleading name is merely heredity and training. We have no thoughts of our own, no opinions of our own. They are transmitted to us, trained into us. All that is original in us, and therefore fairly creditable or discreditable to us, can be covered up and hidden by the point of a cambric needle, all the rest being atoms contributed by and inherited from a procession of ancestors that stretches back 1,000,000,000 years, to the atom clan or grasshopper or monkey from whom our race has been so tediously and ostentatiously and unprofitably developed. And as for me, all that I think about in this plodding, sad pilgrimage, this pathetic drift between the eternities, is to look out and humbly live a pure and high and blameless life, and save that one microscopic atom in me that is truly me. The rest may land in Sheol, and welcome for all I care. No, confound her, her intellect was good. She had brains enough, but her training made her an ass. That is, from a many centuries later point of view. To kill the page was no crime, it was her right, and upon her right she stood, serenely and unconscious of offense. She was a result of generations of training in the unexamined and unassailed belief that the law which permitted her to kill a subject when she chose was a perfectly right and righteous one. Well, she must give even Satan his due. She deserved a compliment for one thing, and I tried to pay it, but the words stuck in my throat. She had a right to kill the boy, but she was in no wise obliged to pay for him. That was law for some other people, but not for her. She knew quite well that she was doing a large and generous thing to pay for that lad, and that I ought in common fairness to come out with something handsome about it. But I couldn't. My mouth refused. I couldn't help seeing, in my fancy, that poor old grandma with the broken heart, and that fair young creature lying butchered in his little silken pomps and vanities laced with his golden blood. How could she pay for him? Whom could she pay? And so, well knowing that this woman, trained as she had been, deserved praise, even adulation, I was yet not able to utter it, trained as I had been. The best I could do was to fish up a compliment from outside, so to speak, and the pity of it was that it was true. Madam, your people will adore you for this. Quite true, but I meant to hang her for it some day if I lived. Some of those laws were too bad, altogether too bad. A master might kill his slave for nothing, for mere spite, malice, or to pass the time, just as we have seen that the crowned head could do it with his slave. That is to say, anybody. A gentleman could kill a free commoner and pay for him, cash or garden truck. A noble could kill a noble without expense as far as the law was concerned, but reprisals in kind were to be expected. Anybody could kill somebody, except the commoner and the slave. These had no privileges. If they killed, it was murder, and the law wouldn't stand murder. It made short work of the experimenter, and of his family, too, if he murdered somebody who belonged up among the ornamental ranks. If a commoner gave a noble even so much as a Damien's scratch, which didn't kill or even hurt, he got Damien's dose for it just the same. They pulled him to rags and tatters with horses, and all the world came to see the show and crack jokes and have a good time. And some of the performances of the best people present were as tough and as properly unprintable as any that have been printed by the pleasant Casanova in his chapter about the dismemberment of Louis XV's poor awkward enemy. I had had enough of this grisly place by this time, and wanted to leave, but I couldn't, because I had something on my mind that my conscience kept prodding me about, and wouldn't let me forget. If I had the remaking of man, he wouldn't have any conscience. It is one of the most disagreeable things connected with a person, and although it certainly does a great deal of good, it cannot be said to pay in the long run. It would be much better to have less good and more comfort. Still, this is only my opinion, and I am only one man. Others with less experience may think differently. They have a right to their view. I only stand to this. I have noticed my conscience for many years, and I know it is more trouble and bother to me than anything else I started with. I suppose that in the beginning I prized it, because we prize anything that is ours, and yet how foolish it was to think so. If we look at it another way, we see how absurd it is. If I had an anvil in me, would I prize it? Of course not. And yet, when you come to think, there is no real difference between a conscience and an anvil, for comfort. I have noticed it 1,000 times, and you could dissolve an anvil with acids when you couldn't stand it any longer, but there isn't any way that you can work off a conscience, at least so it will stay worked off. Not that I know of, anyway. There was something I wanted to do before leaving, but it was a disagreeable matter, and I hated to go at it. Well, it bothered me all the morning. I could have mentioned it to the old king, but what would be the use? He was but an extinct volcano. He had been active in his time, but his fire was out. This good while he was only a stately ash pile now, gentle enough and kindly enough for my purpose, without doubt, but not usable. He was nothing, this so-called king. The queen was the only power here, and she was a Vesuvius. As a favor, she might consent to warm a flock of sparrows for you, but then she might take that very opportunity to turn herself loose and bury a city. However, I reflected that as often as any other way, When you are expecting the worst, you get something that is not so bad after all. So I braced up and placed my matter before Her Royal Highness. I said I had been having a general jail delivery at Camelot and among neighboring castles, and with her permission I would like to examine her collection, her bric-a-brac, that is to say, her prisoners. She resisted, but I was expecting that. But she finally consented. I was expecting that too, but not so soon. That about ended my discomfort. She called her guards and torches, and we went down into the dungeons. These were down under the castle's foundations, and mainly were small cells hollowed out of the living rock. Some of these cells had no light at all. In one of them was a woman in foul rags who sat on the ground and would not answer a question or speak a word, but only looked up at us once or twice through a cobweb of tangled hair, as if to see what casual thing it might be that was disturbing with sound and light the meaningless dull dream that was become her life. After that she sat bowed and with her dirt-caked fingers idly interlocked in her lap, and gave no further sign. This poor rack of bones was a woman of middle age, apparently, but only apparently. She had been there 9 years, and was 18 when she entered. She was a commoner, and had been sent here on her bridal night by Sir Bruce Sans Pete, a neighboring lord, whose vassal her father was, and to which said lord she had refused what has since been called le droit du seigneur, and moreover had opposed violence to violence, and spilt half a gill of his almost sacred blood. The young husband had interfered at that point, believing the bride's life in danger, and had flung the noble out into the midst of the humble and trembling wedding guests in the parlor, and left him there astonished at this strange treatment, and implacably embittered against both bride and groom. The said lord, being cramped for dungeon room, had asked the queen to accommodate his 2 criminals, and here in her Bastille they had been ever since. Hither, indeed, they had come before their crime was an hour old, and had never seen each other since. Here they were, kennelled like toads in the same rock. They had passed 9 pitch-dark years within 50 feet of each other, yet neither knew whether the other was alive or not. All the first years their only question had been asked, with beseechings and tears that might have moved stones in time, perhaps, but hearts are not stones. Is he alive? Is she alive? But they had never got an answer, and at last that question was not asked any more, or any other. I wanted to see the man after hearing all this. He was 34 years old, and looked 60. He sat upon a squared block of stone, with his head bent down, his forearms resting on his knees, his long hair hanging like a fringe before his face, and he was muttering to himself. He raised his chin and looked us over slowly, in a listless, dull way, blinking with the distress of the torchlight, then dropped his head and fell to muttering again, and took no further notice of us. There were some pathetically suggestive dumb witnesses present. On his wrists and ankles were cicatrices, smooth old scars, and fastened to the stone on which he sat was a chain with manacles and fetters attached. But this apparatus lay idle on the ground, and was thick with rust. Chains ceased to be needed after the spirit was gone out of a prisoner. I could not rouse the man, so I said we would take him to her, and see to the bride, who was the fairest thing in the earth to him, once roses, pearls, and dew made of flesh for him, a wonder-work, the masterwork of nature, with eyes like no other eyes, and voice like no other voice, and a freshness and lithe young grace and beauty that belonged properly to the creatures of dreams, as he thought, and to no other. The sight of her would set his stagnant blood leaping, the sight of her. But it was disappointment. They sat together on the ground, and looked dimly, wondering into each other's eyes, a while with a sort of weak animal curiosity, then forgot each other's presence, and dropped their eyes, and you saw that they were again away and wandering in some far land of dreams and shadows that we know nothing about. I had them taken out and sent to their friends. The Queen did not like it much, not that she felt any personal interest in the matter, but she thought it disrespectful to Sir Bruce sans Pete. However, I assured her that if he found he couldn't stand it, I would fix him so he could. I set 47 prisoners loose out of those awful rat holes, and left only one in captivity. He was a lord, and had killed another lord, a sort of kinsman of the Queen. That other lord had ambushed him to assassinate him, but this fellow had got the best of him and cut his throat. However, it was not for that I left him jailed, but for maliciously destroying the only public well in one of his wretched villages. The Queen was bound to hang him for killing her kinsman, but I would not allow it. It was no crime to kill an assassin. But I said I was willing to let her hang him for destroying the well, so she concluded to put up with that, as it was better than nothing. Dear me, for what trifling offenses the most of these 47 men and women were shut up there. Indeed, some were there for no distinct offense at all, but only to gratify somebody's spite. And not always the Queen's by any means, but a friend's. The newest prisoner's crime was a mere remark which he had made. He said he believed that men were about all alike, and one man as good as another, barring clothes. He said he believed that if you were to strip the nation naked and send a stranger through the crowd, he couldn't tell the Queen from a quack doctor, nor a duke from a hotel clerk. Apparently, here was a man whose brains had not been reduced to an ineffectual mush by idiotic training. I set him loose and sent him to the factory. Some of the cells, carved in the living rock, were just behind the face of the precipice, and in each of these an arrow slit had been pierced outward to the daylight, and so the captive had a thin ray from the blessed sun for his comfort. The case of one of these poor fellows was particularly hard. From his dusky swallow's hole high up in that vast wall of native rock, he could peer out through the arrow slit and see his own home off yonder in the valley. And for 22 years he had watched it, with heartache and longing, through that crack. He could see the lights shine there at night, and in the daytime he could see figures go in and come out, his wife and children, some of them, no doubt, though he could not make out at that distance. In the course of years he noted festivities there, and tried to rejoice, and wondered if there were weddings or what they might be. And he noted funerals, and they wrung his heart. He could make out the coffin, but he could not determine its size, and so could not tell whether it was wife or child. He could see the procession form with priests and mourners, and move solemnly away, bearing the secret with them. He had left behind him 5 children and a wife, and in 19 years he had seen 5 funerals issue, and none of them humble enough in pomp to denote a servant. So he had lost 5 of his treasures. There must still be one remaining, one now infinitely, unspeakably precious. But which one? Wife or child? That was the question that tortured him by night and by day, asleep and awake. Well, to have an interest of some sort and half a ray of light when you are in a dungeon is a great support to the body and preserver of the intellect. This man was in pretty good condition, yet by the time he had finished telling me his distressful tale, I was in the same state of mind that you would have been yourself if you had got average human curiosity. That is to say, I was as burning up as he was to find out which member of the family it was that was left. So I took him over home myself, and an amazing kind of surprise party it was, too. Typhoons and cyclones of frantic joy, and whole Niagaras of happy tears, and by George, we found the aforetime young matron graying toward the imminent verge of her half-century, and the babies all men and women, and some of them married and experimenting family-wise themselves, for not a soul of the tribe was dead. Conceive of the ingenious devilishness of that queen. She had a special hatred for this prisoner, and she had invented all those funerals herself, to scorch his heart with, and the sublimest stroke of genius of the whole thing was leaving the family invoice a funeral short, so as to let him wear his poor old soul out guessing. But for me, he never would have got out. Morgan Le Fay hated him with her whole heart, and she never would have softened toward him, and yet his crime was committed more in thoughtlessness than in desperate depravity. He had said she had red hair. Well, she had, but that was no way to speak of it. When red-headed people are above a certain social grade, their hair is auburn. Consider it. Among these 47 captives, there were 5 whose names, offenses, and dates of incarceration were no longer known. 1 woman and 4 men, all bent and wrinkled and mind-extinguished patriarchs. They themselves had long ago forgotten these details. At any rate, they had mere vague theories about them, nothing definite and nothing that they repeated twice in the same way. The succession of priests whose office it had been to pray daily with the captives and remind them that God had put them there for some wise purpose or other, and teach them that patience, humbleness, and submission to oppression was what he loved to see in parties of a subordinate rank, had traditions about these poor old human ruins, but nothing more. These traditions went but little way, for they concerned the length of the incarceration only, and not the names of the offenses. And even by the help of tradition, the only thing that could be proven was that none of the 5 had seen daylight for 35 years. How much longer this privation has lasted was not guessable. The king and the queen knew nothing about these poor creatures, except that they were heirlooms, assets inherited along with the throne from the former firm. Nothing of their history had been transmitted with their persons, and so the inheriting owners had considered them of no value, and had felt no interest in them. I said to the queen, "Then why in the world didn't you set them free?" The question was a puzzler. She didn't know why she hadn't. The thing had never come up in her mind. So here she was, forecasting the veritable history of future prisoners of the Castle d'If without knowing it. It seemed plain to me now that with her training, those inherited prisoners were merely property. Nothing more, nothing less. Well, when we inherit property, it does not occur to us to throw it away, even when we do not value it. When I brought my procession of human bats up into the open world and the glare of the afternoon sun, previously blindfolding them, in charity for eyes so long untortured by light, they were a spectacle to look at. Skeletons, scarecrows, goblins, pathetic frights, every one. Legitimatest possible children of monarchy by the grace of God and the established church. I muttered absently, "I wish I could photograph them." You have seen that kind of people who will never let on that they don't know the meaning of a new big word. The more ignorant they are, the more pitifully certain they are to pretend you haven't shot over their heads. The queen was just one of that sort, and was always making the stupidest blunders by reason of it. She hesitated a moment, then her face brightened up with sudden comprehension, and she said she would do it for me. I thought to myself, why, what can she know about photography? But it was a poor time to be thinking. When I looked around, she was moving on the procession with an axe. Well, she certainly was a curious one, was Morgan Le Fay. I have seen a good many kinds of women in my time, but she laid over them all for variety, and how sharply characteristic of her this episode was. She had no more idea than a horse of how to photograph a procession, but being in doubt, it was just like her to try to do it with an axe. Chapter 19. Knight Errantry as a Trade. Sandy and I were on the road again, next morning bright and early. It was so good to open up one's lungs and take in whole luscious barrels full of blessed God's untainted, dew-fashioned, woodland-scented air once more, after suffocating body and mind for 2 days and nights in the moral and physical stenches of that intolerable old buzzard roost. I mean, for me. Of course the place was all right and agreeable enough for Sandy, for she had been used to high life all her days. Poor girl, her jaws had had a wearisome rest now for a while, and I was expecting to get the consequences. I was right, but she had stood by me most helpfully in the castle, and had mightily supported and reinforced me with gigantic foolishnesses, which were worth more for the occasion than wisdoms double their size. So I thought she had earned a right to work her mill for a while, if she wanted to, and I felt not a pang when she started it up. Now turn we into Sir Marhaus that rode with the damsel of 30 winter of age southward. Are you going to see if you can work up another half stretch on the trail of the cowboys, Sandy? Even so, my fair lord. Go ahead, then. I won't interrupt this time if I can help it. Begin over again, start fair, and shake out all your reefs, and I will load my pipe and give good attention. Now turn we unto Sir Marhaus that rode with the damsel of 30 winter of age southward. And so they came into a deep forest, and by fortune they were nighted, and rode along in a deep way. And at the last they came into a courtelage where abode the Duke of South Marches, and there they asked harbour. And on the morn the Duke sent unto Sir Marhaus, and bade him make him ready. And so Sir Marhaus arose and armed him, and there was a mass sung afore him, and he brake his fast, and so mounted on horseback in the court of the castle. And there they should do the battle. So there was the Duke already on horseback, clean armed, and his 6 sons by him, and every each had a spear in his hand. And so they encountered, whereas the Duke and his 2 sons brake their spears upon him. But Sir Marhaus held up his spear and touched none of them. Then came the 4 sons by couples, and 2 of them brake their spears, and so did the other 2. And all this while Sir Marhaus touched them not. Then Sir Marhaus ran to the Duke, and smote him with his spear, that horse and man fell to the earth. And so he served his sons. And then Sir Marhaus alight down, and bade the Duke yield him, or else he would slay him. And then some of his sons recovered, and would have set upon Sir Marhaus. Then Sir Marhaus said to the Duke, Cease thy sons, or else I will do the uttermost to you all. When the Duke saw he might not escape the death, he cried to his sons, and charged them to yield to Sir Marhaus. And they kneeled all down, and put the pommels of their swords to the knight, and so he received them. And then they holp up their father, and so by their common assent promised unto Sir Marhaus never to be foes unto King Arthur, and to thereupon, at Whitsuntide after, to come he and his sons, and put them in the king's grace. Footnote: the story is borrowed, language and all, from the Morte d'Arthur, Mark Twain. Even so standeth the history, fair Sir Boss. Now ye shall wit that that very Duke and his 6 sons are they whom but few days past you also did overcome and send to Arthur's court. Why, Sandy, you can't mean it. And I speak not sooth. Let it be for the worse for me. Well, well, well. Now who would have ever thought it? 1 whole Duke and 6 dukelets. Why, Sandy, it was an elegant haul. Knight-errantry is a most chuckle-headed trade, and it is tedious hard work, too. But I begin to see that there is money in it after all, if you have luck. Not that I would ever engage in it as a business, for I wouldn't. No sound and legitimate business can be established on a basis of speculation. A successful whirl in the knight-errantry line, what is it when you blow away the nonsense and come down to the cold facts? It's just a corner in pork, that's all, and you can't make anything else out of it. You're rich, yes, suddenly rich, for about a day, maybe a week. Then somebody corners the market on you, and down goes your bucket shop. Ain't that so, Sandy? Whethersoever it be that my mind miscarrieth, bewraying simple language in such sort that the words do seem to come endlong and overthwart. There's no use in beating about the bush and trying to get around it that way, Sandy. It's so, just as I say. I know it's so. And, moreover, when you come right down to the bedrock, knight-errantry is worse than pork, for whatever happens, the pork's left, and so somebody's benefited anyway. But when the market breaks, in a knight-errantry whirl, every knight in the pool passes in his checks. What have you got for assets? Just a rubbish pile of battered corpses, and a barrel or 2 of busted hardware. Can you call those assets? Give me pork every time, am I right? Ah, peradventure my head being distraught by the manifold matters whereunto the confusion of these, but late adventures, haps, and fortunings, whereby not I alone, nor you alone, but every each of us, meseemeth. No, it's not your head, Sandy. Your head's all right as far as it goes, but you don't know business. That's where the trouble is. It unfits you to argue about business, and you're wrong to be always trying. However, that aside, it was a good haul anyway, and will breed a handsome crop of reputation in Arthur's Court. And speaking of the cowboys, what a curious country this is for women and men that never get old. Now there's Morgan Le Fay, as fresh and young as a Vassar pullet to all appearances, and here is this old Duke of the South Marches, still slashing away with sword and lance at his time of life, after raising such a family as he has raised. As I understand it, Sir Gawain killed 7 of his sons, and still he had 6 left for Sir Marhaus and me to take into camp. And then there was that damsel of 60 winter of age, still excursioning around in her frosty bloom. How old are you, Sandy? It was the first time I ever struck a still place in her. The mill had shut down for repairs or something. Chapter 20. The Ogre's Castle. Between 6 and 9 we made 10 miles, which was plenty for a horse-carrying triple, man, woman, and armor. Then we stopped for a long nooning under some trees by a limpid brook. Right so came by and by a knight riding, and as he drew near he made a dolorous moan, and by the words of it I perceived that he was cursing and swearing. Yet nevertheless I was glad of his coming, for that I saw he bore a bulletin board whereon his letters, all of shining gold, was writ, "Use Peterson's prophylactic toothbrush, all the go." I was glad of his coming, for even by this token I knew him for a knight of mine. It was Sir Madok de la Montaigne, a burly great fellow whose chief distinction was that he had come within an ace of sending Sir Launcelot down over his horsetail once. He was never long in a stranger's presence without finding some pretext or other to let out that great fact, but there was another fact of nearly the same size which he never pushed upon anybody unasked, and yet never withheld when asked, and that was that the reason he didn't quite succeed was that he was interrupted and sent down over horsetail himself. This innocent vast lover did not see any particular difference between the two facts. I liked him, for he was earnest in his work and very valuable, and the grand leonine set of his plumed head, with his big shield with its quaint device of a gauntleted hand clutching a prophylactic toothbrush with motto Tri Nuiodont, was a toothwash that I was introducing. He was wary, he said, and indeed he looked it, but he would not alight. He said he was after the stove polish man, and with this he broke out cursing and swearing anew. The bulletin boarder referred to was Sir Oasis of Sir Lurs, a brave knight and of considerable celebrity on account of his having tried conclusions in a tournament once with no less a mogul than Sir Gaheris himself, although not successfully. He was of a light and laughing disposition, and to him nothing in this world was serious. It was for this reason that I had chosen him to work up a stove polish sentiment. There were no stoves yet, and so there could be nothing serious about stove polish. All that the agent needed to do was to deftly and by degrees prepare the public for the great change, and have them established in predilections toward neatness against the time when the stove should appear upon the stage. Sir Madok was very bitter, and brake out anew with cursings. He said he had cursed his soul to rags, and yet he would not get down from his horse, neither would he take any rest, or listen to any comfort until he should have found Sir Oasis and settled this account. It appeared, by what I could piece together of the unprofane fragments of his statement, that he had chanced upon Sir Oasis at dawn of the morning, and had been told that if he would make a short-cut across the fields and swamps and broken hills and glades, he could head off a company of travelers who would be rare customers for prophylactics and toothwash. With characteristic zeal, Sir Madok had plunged away at once upon this quest, and after 3 hours of awful cross-lot riding had overhauled his game. And behold, it was the 5 patriarchs that had been released from the dungeons the evenings before. Poor old creature, it was all of 20 years since any one of them had known what it was to be equipped with any remaining snag or remnant of a tooth. Blank, blank, blank him, said Sir Maddock, and I do not stove polish him, and I may find him, leave it to me, for never no knight that hight Oasis, or aught else, may do me this disservice, and bide on live. And I may find him, which I have thereunto sworn a great oath this day. And with these words and others, he lightly took his spear and gat him thence. In the middle of the afternoon we came upon one of those very patriarchs ourselves, in the edge of a poor village. He was basking in the love of relatives and friends whom he had not seen for 50 years, and about him and caressing him were also descendants of his own body, whom he had never seen at all till now. But to him these were all strangers. His memory was gone, his mind was stagnant. It seemed incredible that a man could outlast half a century shut up in a dark hole like a rat. But here were his old wife and some old comrades to testify it. They could remember him as he was in the freshness and strength of his young manhood, when he kissed his child and delivered it to his mother's hands and went away into that long oblivion. The people at the castle could not tell within half a generation the length of time the man had been shut up there for his unrecorded and forgotten offense. But this old wife knew, and so did her old child, who stood there among her married sons and daughters, trying to realize a father who had been to her a name, a thought, a formless image, a tradition all her life, and now was suddenly concreted into actual flesh and blood and set before her face. It was a curious situation, yet it is not on that account that I have made room for it here, but on occasion of a thing which seemed to me still more curious, to wit, that this dreadful matter brought from these downtrodden people no outburst of rage against these oppressors. They had been heritors and subjects of cruelty and outrage so long that nothing could have startled them but a kindness. Yet here was a curious revelation, indeed, of the depth to which this people had been slunk in slavery. Their entire being was reduced to a monotonous dead level of patience, resignation, dumb, uncomplaining acceptance of whatever might befall them in this life. Their very imagination was dead. When you can say that of a man, he has struck bottom. I reckon there is no lower deep for him. I rather wished I had gone some other road. This was not the sort of experience for a statesman to encounter who was planning out a peaceful revolution in his mind, for it could not help bringing up the unget-aroundable fact that, all gentle cant and philosophizing to the contrary notwithstanding, no people in the world ever did achieve their freedom by goody-goody talk and moral suasion, it being immutable law that all revolutions that will succeed must begin in blood. Whatever may answer afterward, if history teaches anything, it teaches that. What this folk needed, then, was a reign of terror and a guillotine, and I was the wrong man for them. 2 days later, toward noon, Sandy began to show signs of excitement and feverish expectancy. She said we were approaching the ogre's castle. I was surprised into an uncomfortable shock. The object of our quest had gradually dropped out of my mind. This sudden resurrection of it made it seem quite a real and startling thing for a moment, and roused up in me a smart interest. Sandy's excitement increased every moment, and so did mine, for that sort of thing is catching. My heart got to thumping. You can't reason with your heart, it has its own laws, and thumps about things which the intellect scorns. Presently, when Sandy slid from the horse, motioned me to stop, and went creeping stealthily, with her head bent nearly to her knees, toward a row of bushes that bordered a declivity, the thumpings grew stronger and quicker, and they kept it up while she was gaining her ambush and getting her glimpse over the declivity, and also while I was creeping to her side on my knees. Her eyes were burning now, and she pointed with her finger, and said in a panting whisper, the castle, lo where it looms." What a welcome disappointment I experienced. I said, "Castle, it is nothing but a pigsty with a wattled fence around it." She looked surprised and distressed. The animation faded out of her face, and during many moments she was lost in thought and silent. Then, "It was not enchanted aforetime," she said in a musing fashion, as if to herself, And how strange is this marvel, and how awful, that to the one perception it is enchanted and dight in a base and shameful aspect, yet to the perception of the other it is not enchanted, hath suffered no change, but stands firm and stately still, girt with its moat and waving its banners in the blue air from its tower. And God shield us, how it pricks the heart to see again these gracious captives, and the sorrow deepened in their sweet faces. We have tarried along, and are to blame. I saw my cue. The castle was enchanted to me, not to her. It would be wasted time to try to argue her out of her delusion. It couldn't be done. I must just humor it. So I said, "This is a common case, the enchanting of a thing to one eye and leaving it in its proper form to another. You have heard of it before, Sandy, though you haven't happened to experience, but no harm is done. In fact, it is lucky the way it is. If these ladies were hogs to everybody and to themselves, it would be necessary to break the enchantment, and that might be impossible if one failed to find out the particular process of the enchantment, and hazardous too, for in attempting a disenchantment without the true key, you are liable to err, and turn your hogs into dogs, and the dogs into cats, the cats into rats, and so on, and end by reducing your materials to nothing finally, or to an odorless gas which you can't follow, which of course amounts to the same thing. But here, by any good luck, no one's eyes but mine are under the enchantment, and so it is of no consequence to dissolve it. These ladies remain ladies to you, and to themselves, and to everybody else, and at that same time they will suffer in no way from this delusion. For when I know that an ostensible hog is a lady, that is enough for me. I know how to treat her." "Thanks, O sweet my lord, thou talkest like an angel, and I know thou wilt deliver them, for that thou art minded to great deeds, and art as strong a knight of your hand, and as brave to will as to do as any that is on live." "I will not leave a princess in the sty, Sandy. Are those three yonder that to my disordered eyes are starving swineherds?" "The ogres, are they changed also? It is most wonderful. Now I am fearful, for how canst thou strike with sure aim, when 5 of their 9 cubits of stature are to thee invisible?" "Ah, go warily, fair sir. This is a mightier enterprise than I wend." "You be easy, Sandy. All I need to know is how much of an ogre is invisible. Then I know how to locate his vitals. Don't you be afraid. I will make short work of these bunco steerers. Stay where you are." I left Sandy kneeling there, corpse-faced but plucky and hopeful, and rode down to the pigsty and struck up a trade with the swineherds. I won their gratitude by buying out all the hogs at the lump of 16 pennies, which was rather above the latest quotations. I was just in time, for the church, the lord of the manor, and the rest of the tax-gatherers would have been along next day and swept off pretty much all the stock, leaving the swineherds very short of hogs and Sandy out of princesses. But now the tax people could be paid in cash, and there would be a stake left besides. One of the men had 10 children, and he said that last year when a priest came and of his 10 pigs took the fattest one for tithes, the wife burst out upon him and offered him a child, and said, "Thou beast without bowels of mercy, why leave me my child, yet rob me of the wherewithal to feed it?" How curious! The same thing had happened in the Wales of my day under this same old established church, which was supposed by many to have changed its nature when it changed its disguise. I sent the 3 men away, and then opened the sty gate and beckoned Sandy to come, which she did, and not leisurely, but with the rush of a prairie fire. And when I saw her fling herself upon those hogs, with tears of joy running down her cheeks, and strain them to her heart, and kiss them, and caress them, and call them reverently by grand princely names, I was ashamed of her, and ashamed of the human race. We had to drive those hogs home, 10 miles, and no ladies were ever more fickle-minded or contrary. They would stay in no road, no path. They broke out through the brush on all sides, and flowed away in all directions over rocks and hills and the roughest places they could find, and they must not be struck or roughly accosted. Sandy could not bear to see them treated in ways unbecoming their rank. The troublesomest old sow of the lot had to be called my lady and your highness, like the rest. It is annoying and difficult to scour around after hogs in armor. There was one small countess with an iron ring in her snout and hardly any hair on her back that was the devil for perversity. She gave me a race of an hour over all sorts of country, and then we were right where we had started from, having made not a rod of real progress. I seized her at last by the tail and brought her along squealing. When I overtook Sandy, she was horrified, and said it was in the last degree indelicate to drag a countess by her train. We got the hogs home just at dark, most of them. The Princess Nerons de Morganore was missing, and two of her ladies-in-waiting, namely Miss Angela Bohun and the damsel Elaine Courtemains. The former of these two being a young black sow with a white star in her forehead, and the latter a brown one with thin legs and a slight limp in the forward shank on the starboard side. A couple of the tryingest blisters to drive that I ever saw. Also among the missing were several mere baronesses, and I wanted them to stay missing, but no, all that sausage meat had to be found. So servants were sent out with torches to scour the woods and hills to that end. Of course, the whole drove was housed in the house, and great guns. Well, I never saw anything like it, nor ever heard anything like it, and never smelt anything like it. It was like an insurrection in a gasometer. Chapter 21. The Pilgrims. When I did get to bed at last, I was unspeakably tired. The stretching out and the relaxing of the long tense muscles, how luxurious, how delicious. But that was as far as I could get. Sleep was out of the question for the present. The ripping and tearing and squealing of the nobility up and down the halls and corridors was pandemonium come again, and kept me broad awake. Being awake, my thoughts were busy, of course, and mainly they busied themselves with Sandy's curious delusion. Here she was, as sane a person as the kingdom could produce, and yet, from my point of view, she was acting like a crazy woman. My land, the power of training, of influence, of education. It can bring a body up to believe anything. I had to put myself in Sandy's place to realize that she was not a lunatic. Yes, and put her in mine to demonstrate how easy it is to seem a lunatic to a person who has not been taught as you have been taught. If I had told Sandy I had seen a wagon, uninfluenced by enchantment, spin along 50 miles an hour, had seen a man, unequipped with magic powers, get into a basket and soar out of sight among the clouds, and had listened, without any necromancer's help, to the conversation of a person who was several hundred miles away, Sandy would not merely have supposed me to be crazy, she would have thought she knew it. Everybody around her believed in enchantments. Nobody had any doubts. To doubt that a castle could be turned into a sty and its occupants into hogs would have been the same as my doubting among Connecticut people the actuality of the telephone and its wonders. And in both cases would be absolute proof of a diseased mind, an unsettled reason. Yes, Sandy was sane. Sane, that must be admitted. If I also would be sane, to Sandy I must keep my superstitions about unenchanted and unmiraculous locomotives, balloons, and telephones to myself. Also, I believed that the world was not flat and hadn't pillars under it to support it, nor a canopy over it to turn off a universe of water that occupied all space above. But as I was the only person in the kingdom afflicted with such impious and criminal opinions, I recognized that it would be good wisdom to keep quiet about this matter too, if I did not wish to be suddenly shunned and forsaken by everybody as a madman. The next morning, Sandy assembled the swine in the dining room and gave them their breakfast, waiting upon them personally, and manifesting in every way the deep reverence which the natives of her island, ancient and modern, have always felt for rank, let its outward casket and the mental and moral contents be what they may. I could have eaten with the hogs if I had had birth approaching my lofty official rank, but I hadn't, and so accepted the unavoidable slight and made no complaint. Sandy and I had our breakfast at the second table. The family were not at home. I said, "How many are in the family, Sandy, and where do they keep themselves?" "Family?" "Yes." "Which family, good my lord?" "Why, this family, your own family." "Sooth to say, I understand you not. I have no family." "No family? Why, Sandy, isn't this your home?" "Now how indeed might that be? I have no home." "Well, then, whose house is this?" "Ah, wit you well, I would tell you, and I knew myself." "Come, you don't even know these people? Then who invited us here?" "None invited us, but we came, that is all." "Why, woman, this is a most extraordinary performance. The effrontery of it is beyond admiration. We blandly march into a man's house and cram it full of the only really valuable nobility the sun has yet discovered in the earth, and then it turns out that we don't even know the man's name. How did you ever venture to take this extravagant liberty? I supposed, of course, it was your home. What will the man say?" "What will he say? Forsooth, what can he say but give thanks?" "Thanks for what?" Her face was filled with a puzzled surprise. "Verily, thou troublest mine understanding with strange words. Do you dream that one of his estate is like to have the honor twice in his lifetime to entertain company such as we have brought to grace this house withal?" "Well, no, when you come to that. No, it's an even bet that this is the first time he has had a treat like this." "Then let him be thankful, and manifest the same by grateful speech and due humility. He were a dog else, and the heir and ancestor of dogs." To my mind, the situation was uncomfortable. It might become more so. It might be a good idea to muster the hogs and move on. So I said, "The day is wasting, Sandy. It is time to get the nobility together and be moving." Wherefore, fair sir and boss?" "We want to take them to their home, don't we?" "La, but list to him. They be all of the regions of the earth. Each must hie to her own home. When do you we might do all these journeys in one so brief life as he hath appointed that created life, and thereto to death likewise with the help of Adam, who by sin done through persuasion of his helpmeet, she being wrought upon and bewrayed by the beguilements of the great enemy of man, that serpent hight Satan, aforetime consecrated and set apart unto that evil work by overmastering spite and envy begotten in his heart through fell ambitions that did blight and mildew a nature erst so white and pure, whenso it hove with the shining multitudes, its brethren born in glade and shade of that fair heaven, wherein all such as native be to that rich estate and—" "Great Scott!" "My lord?" "Well, you know we haven't got time for this sort of thing. Don't you see, we could distribute these people around the earth in less time than it is going to take you to explain that we can't. We mustn't talk now, we must act. You want to be careful. You mustn't let your mill get the start of you that way at a time like this. To business now. And sharp's the word. Who is to take the aristocracy home?" "Even their friends. These will come for them from the far parts of the earth." This was the lightning from a clear sky for unexpectedness, and the relief of it was like pardon to a prisoner. She would remain to deliver the goods, of course. "Well then, Sandy, as our enterprise has handsomely and successfully ended, I will go home and report, and if ever another one—" "I am also ready. I will go with thee." This was recalling the pardon. "How? You will go with me? Why should you?" "I will be traitor to my knight, dost think? What, that were dishonor. I may not part from thee until in knightly encounter in the field some overmatching champion shall fairly win and fairly wear me. I were to blame, and thought that might ever hap." Elected for the long term. I sighed to myself. I may as well make the best of it. So then I spoke up and said, "All right, let us make a start." While she was gone to cry her farewells over the pork, I gave that whole peerage away to the servants, and I asked them to take a duster and dust around a little where the nobilities had mainly lodged and promenaded, but they considered that would hardly be worth while, and would moreover be a rather grave departure from custom, and therefore likely to make talk. A departure from custom, that settled it. It was a nation capable of committing any crime but that. The servants said they would follow the fashion, a fashion grown sacred through immemorial observance. They would scatter fresh rushes in all the rooms and halls, and then the evidence of the aristocratic visitation would be no longer visible. It was a kind of satire on nature. It was the scientific method, the geologic method. It deposited the history of the family in a stratified record, and the antiquary could dig through it and tell by the remains of each period what changes of diet the family had introduced successively for 100 years. The first thing we struck that day was a procession of pilgrims. It was not going our way, but we joined it, nevertheless, for it was hourly being borne in upon me now that if I would govern this country wisely, I must be posted in the details of its life, and not at second hand, but by personal observation and scrutiny. This company of pilgrims resembled Chaucer's in this, that it had in it a sample of about all the upper occupations and professions the country could show, and a corresponding variety of costume. There were young men and old men, young women and old women, lively folk and grave folk. They rode upon mules and horses, and there was not a side saddle in the party, for this specialty was to remain unknown in England for 900 years yet. It was a pleasant, friendly, sociable herd, pious, happy, merry, and full of unconscious coarseness and innocent indecencies. What they regarded as the merry tale went the continual round and caused no more embarrassment than it would have caused in the best English society 12 centuries later. Practical jokes, worthy of the English wits of the first quarter of the far-off 19th century, were sprung here and there and yonder along the line, and compelled the delightedest applause, and sometimes when a bright remark was made at one end of the procession and started on its travels toward the other, you could note its progress all the way by the sparkling spray of laughter it threw off from its bows and as it plowed along, and also by the blushes of the mules in its wake. Sandy knew the goal and purpose of this pilgrimage, and she posted me. She said, "The journey to the Valley of Holiness, for to be blessed of the godly hermits and drink of the miraculous waters, and be cleansed from sin." Where is this watering place? It lieth a 2-day journey hence, by the borders of the land that hight the Cuckoo Kingdom. Tell me about it. Is it a celebrated place? Oh, of a truth, yes. There be none more so. Of old time there lived there an abbot and his monks. Belike were none in the world more holy than these, for they gave themselves to study of pious books, and spoke not the one to the other, or indeed to any, and ate decayed herbs and naught thereto, and slept hard, and prayed much, and washed never. Also they wore the same garments until it fell from their bodies through age and decay. Right so they came to be known of all the world by reason of these holy austerities, and they visited by rich and poor and reverenced. Proceed. But always there was lack of water there, whereas upon a time the holy abbot prayed, and for answer a great stream of clear water burst forth by miracle in a desert place. Now were the fickle monks tempted of the fiend, and they wrought with their abbot unceasingly by beggings and beseechings that he would construct a bath. And when he was become aweary and might not resist more, he said, "Have ye your will, then," and granted that they asked. Now mark thou what 'tis to forsake the ways of purity which he loveth, and wanton with such as be worldly and an offence. These monks did enter into the bath, and come thence washed as white as snow. And lo, in that moment his sign appeared, in miraculous rebuke, for his insulted waters ceased to flow, and utterly vanished away. They fared mildly, Sandy, considering how that kind of crime is regarded in this country. Belike, but it was their first sin, and they had been of perfect life for long, and differing in naught from the angels. Prayers, tears, torturings of the flesh, all was vain to beguile that water to flow again. Even processions, even burnt offerings, even votive candles to the Virgin, did fail each every of them, and all in the land did marvel. How odd to find that even this industry has its financial panics, and at times sees its assignments and greenbacks languish to zero, and everything come to a standstill. Go on, Sandy. And so, upon a time, after year and day, the good abbot made humble surrender and destroyed the bath. And behold, his anger was in that moment appeased, and the waters gushed richly forth again, and even unto this day they have not ceased to flow in that generous measure. Then I take it nobody has washed since. He that would essay it could could have his halter free, yes, and swiftly would he need it, too. The community has prospered since. Even from that very day, the fame of the miracle went abroad into all lands. From every land came monks to join, and they came even as the fishes come in shoals, and the monastery added building to building, and yet others to those, and so spread wide its arms and took them in. And nuns came also, and more again, and yet more, and built over against the monastery on the yon side of the vale, and added building to building, until mighty was that nunnery. And these were friendly unto those, and they joined their loving labors together, and together they built a fair great foundling asylum, midway of the valley between. You spoke of some hermits, Sandy. These have gathered there from the ends of the earth. A hermit thriveth best where there be multitudes of pilgrims. Ye shall not find no hermit of no sort wanting. If any shall mention a hermit of a kind he thinketh new, and not to be found but in some far strange land, let him but scratch among the holes and caves and swamps that line that valley of holiness, and whatsoever be his breed, it skills not, he shall find a sample of it here. I closed up alongside of a burly fellow with a fat, good-humored face, proposing to make myself agreeable and pick up some further crumbs of fact. But I had hardly more than scraped acquaintance with him when he began eagerly and awkwardly to lead up in the immemorial way to that same old anecdote, the one Sir Dinadan told me that time I got into trouble with Sir Sagramore and was challenged of him on account of it. I excused myself and dropped to the rear of the procession, sad at heart, willing to go hence from this troubled life, this vale of tears, this brief day of broken rest, of cloud and storm, of weary struggle and monotonous defeat, and yet shrinking from the change, as remembering how long eternity is, and how many have wended thither who know that anecdote. Early in the afternoon we overtook another procession of pilgrims, but in this one was no merriment, no jokes, no laughter, no playful ways, nor any happy giddiness, whether of youth or of age. Yet both were here, both age and youth, grey old men and women, strong men and women of middle age, young husbands, young wives, little boys and girls, and 3 babies at the breast. Even the children were smileless. There was not a face among all these 100 people, but was cast down and bore that set expression of hopelessness which is bred of long and hard trials and old acquaintance with despair. They were slaves. Chains led from their fettered feet and their manacled hands to a sole leather belt about their waists, and all except the children were also linked together in a file 6 feet apart by a single chain, which led from collar to collar all down the line. They were on foot and had tramped 300 miles in 18 days. Upon the cheapest odds and ends of food and stingy rations of that, they had slept in these chains every night, bundled together like swine. They had upon their bodies some poor rags, but they could not be said to be clothed. The irons had chafed the skin from their ankles and made sores which were ulcerated and wormy. Their naked feet were torn, and none walked without a limp. Originally there had been 100 of these unfortunates, but about half had been sold on the trip. The trader in charge of them rode a horse and carried a whip with a short handle and a long, heavy lash, divided into several knotted tails at the end. With this whip he cut the shoulders of any that tottered from weariness and pain, and straightened them up. He did not speak. The whip conveyed his desire without that. None of these poor creatures looked up as we rode along by. They showed no consciousness of our presence, and they made no sound but one. That was the dull and awful clank of their chains from end to end of the long file as 43 burdened feet rose and fell in unison. The file moved in a cloud of its own making. All these faces were gray with a coating of dust. One has seen the like of this coating upon furniture in unoccupied houses, and has written his idle thought in it with his finger. I was reminded of this when I noticed the faces of some of those women, young mothers carrying babes, that were near the death and freedom. How a something in their hearts was written in the dust upon their faces, plain to see, and Lord, how plain to read. For it was the track of tears. One of these young mothers was but a girl, and it hurt me to the heart to read that writing, and reflect that it was come up out of the bare breast of such a child, a breast that ought to know not trouble yet, but only the gladness of the morning of life, and no doubt. She reeled just then, giddy with fatigue, and down came the lash and flicked a flake of skin from her naked shoulder. It stung me as if I had been hit instead. The master halted the file and jumped from his horse. He stormed and swore at this girl, and said she had made annoyance enough with her laziness, and as this was the last chance he should have, he would settle the account now. She dropped on her knees and put up her hands and began to beg and cry and implore, in a passion of terror, but the master gave no attention. He snatched the child from her, and then made the men slaves who were chained before and behind her throw her on the ground and hold her there and expose her body. And then he laid on with his lash like a madman, till her back was flayed, she shrieking and struggling the while piteously. One of the men who was holding her turned away his face, and for this humanity he was reviled and flogged. All our pilgrims looked on and commented on the expert way in which the whip was handled. They were too much hardened by lifelong everyday familiarity with slavery to notice that there was anything else in the exhibition that invited comment. This was what slavery could do in the way of ossifying what one may call the superior lobe of human feeling, for these pilgrims were kind-hearted people, and they would not have allowed that man to treat a horse like that. I wanted to stop the whole thing and set the slaves free, but that would not do. I must not interfere too much and get myself a name for riding over the country's laws and the citizens' rights roughshod. If I lived and prospered, I would be the death of slavery, but that I was resolved upon. But I would try to fix it so that when I became its executioner, it should be by command of the nation. Just here was the wayside shop of a smith, and now arrived a landed proprietor who had bought this girl a few miles back, deliverable here where her irons could be taken off. They were removed. Then there was a squabble between the gentleman and the dealer as to which should pay the blacksmith. The moment the girl was delivered from her irons, she flung herself, all tears and frantic sobbings, into the arms of the slave who had turned away his face when she was whipped. He strained her to his breast and smothered her face and the child's with kisses, and washed them with the rain of his tears. I suspected. I inquired. Yes, I was right. It was husband and wife. They had to be torn apart by force. The girl had to be dragged away, and she struggled and fought and shrieked like one gone mad, till a turn of the road hid her from sight, and even after that we could still make out the fading plaint of those receding shrieks. And the husband and father, with his wife and child gone, never to be seen by him again in life. Well, the look of him one might not bear at all, and so I turned away. But I knew I should never get his picture out of my mind again, and there it is to this day, to wring my heartstrings whenever I think of it. We put up at the inn in a village just at nightfall, and when I rose next morning and looked abroad, I was where a knight came riding in the golden glory of the new day, and recognized him for a knight of mine, Sir Ozana le Cur Hardy. He was in the gentleman's furnishings line, and his missionarying specialty was plug hats. He was clothed all in steel, in the beautifulest armor of the time, up to where his helmet ought to have been, but he hadn't any helmet. He wore a shiny stovepipe hat and was ridiculous a spectacle as one might want to see. It was another of my superstitious schemes for extinguishing knighthood by making it grotesque and absurd. Sir Ozana's saddle was hung about with leather hat boxes, and every time he overcame a wandering knight, he swore him into my service and fitted him with a plug and made him wear it. I dressed and ran down to welcome Sir Ozana and get his news. "How is trade?" I asked. "Ye will note that I have but 4 left, sir, yet they were 16 when as I got me from Camelot." "Why, you have certainly done nobly, Sir Ozana. Where have you been foraging of late?" "I am but now come from the Valley of Holiness, please you, sir." "I am pointed for that place myself. Is there anything stirring in the monkery more than common?" "By the mass, ye may not question it. Give him good feed, boy, and stint it not, and thou valuest thy crown, so get ye lightly to the stable, and do even as I bid. Sir, it is parlous news I bring, and be these pilgrims, then ye may not do better, good folk, than gather and hear the tale I have to tell, sith it concerneth you. For as much as ye may go to find that ye will not find, and seek that ye will seek in vain, my life being hostage for my word, and my word and message being these, namely, that a hap has happened whereof the like has not been seen no more but once this 200 years, which was the first and last time that said misfortune strake the holy valley in that form by commandment of the Most High, whereto by reasons just and causes thereunto contributing, wherein the matter the miraculous fount hath ceased to flow." This shout burst from the 20 pilgrim mouths at once. "Ye say well, good people. I was verging to it, even when ye spake." "Has somebody been washing again?" "Nay, it is suspected, but none believe it. It is thought to be some other sin, but none wit what." "How are they feeling about the calamity?" "None may describe it in words. The fount is these 9 days dry. The prayers that did begin then, and the lamentations in sackcloth and ashes, and the holy processions, none of these has ceased nor night nor day, and so the monks and the nuns and the foundlings be all exhausted, and do hang up prayers writ upon parchment, sith that no strength is left in man to lift up voice. And that at last they sent for thee, Sir Boss, to try magic and enchantment, and if you could not come, then was the messenger to fetch Merlin. And he is there these 3 days now, and saith he will fetch that water, though he burst the globe and wreck its kingdoms to accomplish it. And right bravely doth he work his magic, and call upon his hellions to hie them hither and help. But not a whiff of moisture hath he started yet, even so much as might qualify as mist upon a copper mirror, and ye count not the barrel of sweat he sweateth betwixt sun and sun over the dire labours of his task. And if ye—" Breakfast was ready. As soon as it was over, I showed Sir Ozana these words which I had written on the inside of his hat: "Chemical Department, Laboratory Extension, Section G, PXXP. Sent 2 of first size, 2 of number 3, 6 of number 4, together with the proper complimentary details, and 2 of my trained assistants." And I said, "Now get you to Camelot as fast as you can fly, brave knight, and show the writing to Clarence, and tell him to have these required matters in the Valley of Holiness with all possible dispatch." I will well, Sir Boss." And he was off. Chapter 22. The Holy Fountain. The pilgrims were human beings. Otherwise they would have acted differently. They had come a long and difficult journey, and now, when the journey was nearly finished and they learned that the main thing they had come for had ceased to exist, they didn't do as horses or cats or angleworms probably would have done, turn back and get at something profitable. No, anxious as they had been to see the miraculous fountain, they were still as much as 40 times as anxious now to see the place where it used to be. There is no accounting for human beings. We made good time, and a couple of hours before sunset We stood upon the high confines of the Valley of Holiness, and our eyes swept it from end to end and noted its features, that is, its large features. These were the three masses of buildings. They were distant and isolated temporalities, shrunk into toy construction in the lonely waste of what seemed a desert, and was. Such a scene is always mournful. It is so impressively still and looks so steeped in death. But there was a sound here which interrupted the stillness only to add to his mournfulness. This was the faint, far sound of tolling bells which floated fitfully to us on the passing breeze, and so faintly, so softly, that we hardly knew whether we heard it with our ears or with our spirits. We reached the monastery before dark, and there the males were given lodging, but the women were sent over to the nunnery. The bells were close at hand now, and their solemn booming smote upon the ear like a message of doom. A superstitious despair possessed the heart of every monk and published itself in his ghastly face. Everywhere these black-robed, soft-sandaled, tallow-visaged spectres appeared, flitted about, and disappeared, noiselessly, as the creatures of a troubled dream, and as uncanny. The old abbot's joy to see me was pathetic, even to tears. But he did the shedding himself. He said, "Delay not, son, but get to thy saving work, and we bring not the water back again, and soon we are ruined, and the good work of 200 years must end. And see thou do it with enchantments that be holy, for the church will not endure that work in her cause be done by devil's magic. When I work, Father, there will be sure there will be no devil's work connected with it. I shall use no arts that come of the devil, and no elements not created by the hand of God." "But is Merlin working strictly on pious lines?" "Ah, he said he would, my son. He said he would, and took oath to make his promise good." "Well, in that case, let him proceed." "But surely you will not sit idle by, but help?" "It will not answer to mix methods, Father, neither would it be professional courtesy. Two of a trade must not underbid each other. We might as well cut rates and be done with it. It would arrive at that in the end. Merlin has the contract. No other magician can touch it till he throws it up." "But I will take it from him. It is a terrible emergency, and the act is thereby justified. And if it were not so, who will give law to the church? The church giveth law to all, and what she wills to do, that she may do, hurt whom it may. I will take it from him. You shall begin upon the moment." "It may not be, Father. No doubt, as you say, where power is supreme, one can do as one likes and suffer no injury. But we poor magicians are not so situated. Merlin is a very good magician in a small way, and has quite a neat provincial reputation. He is struggling along, doing the best he can, and it would not be etiquette for me to take his job until he himself abandons it." The abbot's face lighted. "Ah, that is simple. There are ways to persuade him to abandon it." "No, no, Father, it skills not, as these people say. If he were persuaded against his will, he would load that well with a malicious enchantment, which would balk me until I found out its secret. It might take a month. I could set up a little enchantment of mine, which I call the telephone, and he could not find out its secret in 100 years. Yes, you perceive, he might block me for a month. Would you like to risk a month in a dry time like this?" "A month? The mere thought of it maketh me to shudder. Have it thy way, my son, but my heart is heavy with this disappointment. Leave me, and let me wear my spirit with weariness and waiting, even as I have done these 10 long days, counterfeiting thus the thing that is called rest, the prone body making outward sign of repose, wherein inwardly is none." Of course, it would have been best, all round, for Merlin to waive etiquette and quit and call it half a day, since he would never be able to start that water, for he was a true magician of the time, which is to say, the big miracles, the ones that gave him his reputation, always had the luck to be performed when nobody but Merlin was present. He couldn't start this well with all this crowd around to see. A crowd was as bad for a magician's miracle in that day as it was for a spiritualist's miracle in mine. There was sure to be some skeptic on hand to turn up the gas at the crucial moment and spoil everything. But I did not want Merlin to retire from the job until I was ready to take hold of it effectively myself, and I could not do that until I got my things from Camelot, and that would take 2 or 3 days. My presence gave the monks hope and cheered them up a good deal, insomuch as they ate a square meal that night for the first time in 10 days. As soon as their stomachs had been properly reinforced with food, their spirits began to rise fast. When the mead began to go round, they rose faster. By the time everybody was half seas over, the holy community was in good shape to make a night of it. So we stayed by the board and put it through on that line. Matters got to be very jolly. Good old questionable stories were told that made the tears run down and cavernous mouths stand wide and the round bellies shake with laughter, and questionable songs were bellowed out in a mighty chorus that drowned the boom of the tolling bells. At last I ventured a story myself, and vast was the success of it. Not right off, of course, for the native of those islands does not, as a rule, dissolve upon the early applications of a humorous thing. But the 5th time I told it, they began to crack in places. The 8th time I told it, they began to crumble, and at the 12th repetition they fell apart in chunks. And at the 15th they disintegrated, and I got a broom and swept them up. This language is figurative. Those islanders, well, they are slow pay at first, in the matter of return for your investment of effort, but in the end they make the pay of all other nations poor and small by contrast. I was at the well next day betimes. Merlin was there, and chanting away like a beaver, but not raising the moisture. He was not in a pleasant humor, and every time I hinted that perhaps this contract was a shade too hefty for a novice, he unlimbered his tongue and cursed like a bishop. French bishop of the Regency days, I mean. Matters were about as I expected to find them. The fountain was an ordinary well. It had been dug in the ordinary way and stoned up in the ordinary way. There was no miracle about it. Even the lie that had created its reputation was not miraculous. I could have told it myself, with one hand tied behind me. The well was in a dark chamber which stood in the center of a cut stone chapel, whose walls were hung with pious pictures of a workmanship that would have made a chromo feel good. Pictures historically commemorative of curative miracles which had been achieved by the waters when nobody was looking. That is, nobody but angels. They are always on deck when there is a miracle to the fore, so as to get put in the picture, perhaps. Angels are as fond of that as a fire company. Look at the old masters. The well chamber was dimly lighted by lamps. The water was drawn with a windlass and chained by monks, and poured into troughs which delivered into stone reservoirs outside in the chapel, when there was water to draw, I mean. And none but monks could enter the well chamber. I entered it, for I had temporary authority to do so, by courtesy of my professional brother and subordinate. But he hadn't entered it himself. He did everything by incantations. He never worked his intellect. If he had stepped in there and used his eyes instead of his disordered mind, he could have cured the well by natural means, and then turned it into a miracle in the customary way. But no, he was an old numbskull, a magician who believed in his own magic, and no magician can thrive who is handicapped with a superstition like that. I had an idea that the well had sprung a leak, that some of the wall stones near the bottom had fallen and exposed fissures that allowed the water to escape. I measured the chain, 98 feet. Then I called in a couple of monks, locked the door, took a candle, and made them lower me in the bucket. When the chain was all paid out, the candle confirmed my suspicion. A considerable section of the wall was gone, exposing a good big fissure. I almost regretted that my theory about the well's trouble was correct, because I had another one that had a showy point or two about it for a miracle. I remembered that in America, many centuries later, when an oil well ceased to flow, they used to blast it out with a dynamite torpedo. If I should find this well dry and no explanation of it, I could astonish these people most nobly by having a person of no especial value drop a dynamite bomb into it. It was my idea to appoint Merlin. However, it was plain that there was no occasion for the bomb. One cannot have everything the way he would like it. A man has no business to be depressed by a disappointment, anyway. He ought to make up his mind to get even. That is what I did. I said to myself, I am in no hurry, I can wait. That bomb will come good yet. And it did, too. When I was above ground again, I turned out the monks and let down a fish line. The well was 150 feet deep, and there was 41 feet of water in it. I called in a monk and asked, "How deep is the well?" "That, sir, I wit not, having never been told." "How does the water usually stand in it?" "Near to the top these 2 centuries, as the testimony goeth, brought down to us through our predecessors." It was true, as to recent times at least, for there was witness to it, and better witness than a monk. Only about 20 or 30 feet of the chain showed wear and use. The rest of it was unworn and rusty. What had happened when the well gave out that other time? Without doubt, some practical person had come along and mended the leak, and then had come up and told the abbot he had discovered by divination that if the sinful bath were destroyed, the well would flow again. The leak had befallen again now, and these children would have prayed and processioned and told their beliefs, told their bells, for heavenly succor until they all dried up and blew away. And no innocent of them all would have ever thought to drop a fish line into the well or go down in it and find out what was really the matter. Old habit of mind is one of the toughest things to get away from in the world. It transmits itself like physical form and feature, and for a man in those days to have had an idea that his ancestors hadn't had would have brought him under suspicion of being illegitimate. I said to the monk, "It is a difficult miracle to restore water in a dry well, but we will try. If my brother Merlin fails, Brother Merlin is a very passable artist, but only in the parlor magic line, and he may not succeed. In fact, is not likely to succeed. But that should be nothing to his discredit. The man can do this kind of magic. Knows enough to keep hotel." "Hotel? I mind not to have heard." "Of hotel? That's what you call hostel. The man that can do this miracle can keep hostel. I can do this miracle, I shall do this miracle, yet I do not try to conceal from you that it is a miracle to tax the occult powers to the last strain." "None knoweth that truth better than the brotherhood, indeed, for it is of record that aforetime it was parlous difficult and took a year. Natheless, God send you good success, and to that end we will pray." As a matter of business, it was a good idea to get the notion around that the thing was difficult. Many a small thing had been made large by the right kind of advertising. That monk was filled up with the difficulty of this enterprise. He would fill up the others. In 2 days the solicitude would be booming. On my way home at noon I met Sandy. She had been sampling the hermits. I said, "I would like to do that myself this Wednesday. Is there a matinee?" "A which, please you, sir?" "Matinee. Do they keep open afternoons?" "Who?" "The hermits, of course." "Keep open?" "Yes, keep open. Isn't that plain enough? Do they knock off at noon?" "Knock off?" "Knock off. Yes, knock off. What is the matter with knock off? I never saw such a dunderhead. Can't you understand anything at all? In plain terms, do they shut up shop, draw the game, bank the fires?" "Shut up shop, draw—" "There, never mind. Let it go. You make me tired. You can't seem to understand the simplest thing." "I would I might please thee, sir, and it is to me dole and sorrow that I fail, albeit sith I am but a simple damsel that taught of none, being of from the cradle, unbaptized in those deep waters of learning that do anoint with a sovereignty him that partaketh of that most noble sacrament, investing him with reverend state to the mental eye of the humble mortal, who, by bar and lack of that great consecration, seeth in his own unlearned estate but a symbol of that other sort of lack and loss, which men do publish to the pitying eye with sackcloth trappings upon the ashes of grief do lie depowdered and bestrewn, and so when such shall in the darkness of his mind encounter these golden phrases on high mystery, these shut up shops and draw the game and bank the fires, it is but the grace of God that he burst not for envy of the mind that can beget, and tongue that can deliver so great and mellow-sounding miracles of speech, and if there do ensue confusion in that humbler mind and failure to divine the meanings of these wonders, then if so that be this miscomprehension is not vain but sooth and true, wit ye well it is the very substance of worshipful dear homage that may not lightly be misprized, nor had been, and ye had noted this complexion of mood and mind, and understood that I would I would, I could not, and that I could not, I might not, nor yet, nor might, nor could, nor might not, nor could not, might be by advantage turned to the desired would, and so I pray you mercy of my fault, and that ye will of your kindness and your charity forgive it, and my good master, and my most dear lord. I couldn't make it all out, that is, the details, but I got the general idea, and enough of it, too, to be ashamed. It was not fair to spring those 19th century technicalities upon the untutored infant of the sixth and then rail at her because she couldn't get their drift. And when she was making the honest best drive at it she could, too, and no fault of hers that she couldn't fetch the home plate, and so I apologized. Then we meandered pleasantly away toward the hermit holes in sociable converse together, and better friends than ever. I was gradually coming to have a mysterious and shuddery reverence for this girl. Nowadays, whenever she pulled out from the situation and got her train fairly started on one of those horizonless transcontinental sentences of hers, it was borne in upon me that I was standing in the awful presence of the mother of the German language. I was so impressed with this that sometimes when she began to empty out one of those sentences on me, I unconsciously took the very attitude of reverence, and stood uncovered, and if words had been water, I had been drowned, sure. She had exactly the German way. Whatever was in her mind to be delivered, whether a mere remark or a sermon or a cyclopedia or the history of a war, she would get it into a single sentence or die. Whenever the literary German dives into a sentence, that is the last you are going to see of him, till he emerges on the other side of his Atlantic with his verb in his mouth. We drifted from hermit to hermit all the afternoon. It was a most strange menagerie. The chief emulation among them seemed to be to see which could manage to be the uncleanest and most prosperous with vermin. Their manner and attitudes were the last expression of complacent self-righteousness. It was one anchorite's pride to lie naked in the mud and let the insects bite him and blister him unmolested. It was another's to lean against a rock all day long, conspicuous to the admiration of the throng of pilgrims, and pray. It was another's to go naked and crawl around on all fours. It was another's to drag about with him, year in and year out, 80 pounds of iron. It was another's to never lie down when he slept, but to stand among the thorn bushes and snore when there were pilgrims around to look. A woman who had the white hair of age and no other apparel was black from crown to heel with 47 years of holy abstinence from water. Groups of gazing pilgrims stood around all and every of these strange objects, lost in reverent wonder, and envious of the feckless sanctity which these pious austerities had won from them and from an exacting heaven. By and by we went to see one of the supremely great ones. He was a mighty celebrity. His fame had penetrated all of Christendom. The noble and the renowned journeyed from the remotest lands on the globe to pay him reverence. His stand was in the center of the widest part of the valley, and it took all that space to hold his crowds. His stand was a pillar of 60 feet high, with a broad platform on the top of it. He was now doing what he had been doing every day for 20 years up there, bowing his body ceaselessly and rapidly, almost to his feet. It was his way of praying. I timed him with a stopwatch, and he made 1,244 revolutions in 24 minutes and 46 seconds. It seemed a pity to have all this power going to waste. It was one of the most useful motions in mechanics, the pedal movement. So I made a note in my memorandum book, proposing someday to apply a system of elastic cords to him and run a sewing machine with it. I afterward carried out that scheme and got 5 years' good service out of him, in which time he turned out upward of 18,000 first-rate tow linen shirts, which was 10 a day. I worked him Sundays and all. He was going Sundays, the same as weekdays, and it was no use to waste the power. These shirts cost me nothing but just the mere trifle for the materials. I furnished those myself. It would not have been right to make him do that, and they sold like smoke to pilgrims at $1.50 apiece, which was the price of 50 cows or a blooded racehorse in Arthurdom. They were regarded as a perfect protection against sin, and advertised as such by my knights everywhere, with the paint pot and stencil plate, insomuch as there was not a cliff or a Bowdler or a dead wall in England but you could read it on, read on it at a mile distance. But the only genuine Saint Stylite patronized by the nobility, patent applied for. There was more money in the business than one knew what to do with. As it extended, I brought out a line of goods suitable for kings and a knobby thing for duchesses and that sort, with ruffles down the forehatch and the running gear clewed up with a feather snitch to leeward and then hauled aft with a backstay and triced up with a half turn in the standard rigging, forward of the weather gaskets. Yes, it was a daisy. But about that time I noticed that the motive power had taken to standing on one leg, and I found that there was something the matter with the other one. So I stocked the business and unloaded, taking Sir Bors de Ganis into camp, financially along with certain of his friends, for the works stopped within a year, and the good saint got him to his rest. But he had earned it, I can say that for him. When I saw him that first time, however, his personal condition will not quite bear description here. You can read it in the Lives of the Saints. All the details concerning the hermits in this chapter are from Lecky, but greatly modified, this book not being a history but only a tale. The majority of the historian's frank details were too strong for reproduction in it. Editor.